All right, Vision of Wu Ji Quan Fa. Again, I guess this is part like 3.2, we'll say. So I started into going through Tom's brochure where he explained the system in his own words for years with Tongwei martial arts, and the discussions we had kind of surrounding that and what the family system was. I'll pick up there. So I, go back. You can watch some of that. We kind of left off where in the brochure it ends by saying that's Wu Ji Quan Fa is a result of a methodical approach to develop the ultimate martial art, or a most complete martial art. Centuries of study, hundreds of family members have been incorporated to make it the most complete, realistic system taught anywhere. Going further with that, Tom's like, that's explaining it to the public, what we learned. And that's explaining it in the 90s, late 80s, 90s era, and what appealed to people then. I would say with the internet, one big thing that changes the communication, and this was something that I had to figure out over the years, and I think a lot of people have too. And it's a joke, kind of, but certainly and I think a lot of martial arts styles run into this too, especially traditional ones. The stories are kind of like hyper real of how a lot of martial arts come to be. And, there's like someone who's fighting lots and lots of people and they're getting beat. And, like if you take a knife fighting style, this was developed, and it's the best knife fight, but it's like, how many people do you know that have personally survived the number of knife fights it would take to get a definitive approach to doing it? And why are they not being arrested in modern times? And why are they wandering around doing that? Like, what kind of criminal enterprise are we talking about here? And so it's kind of hyper real, some of the origin stories. And I'm not going to call out who. And that, to some degree, what it would take to have, to have that, sometimes the origin stories are just kind of crazy. They're hyper real. And I'm trying to tell this one in a very not hyper real way, on purpose. I think in the 90s, 80s, one of the quotes I remember Tom sharing, he was in sales for a long time when he was talking about, how we're going to promote this seminar. And sometimes, honestly, we would differ in our approach. He was the man, so I'd just defer, and we would do what he wanted to do to promote it. It's his seminars. He'd say it's not the bacon that sells, it's the sizzle. And so sometimes you're telling things in, like kind of that hyper real way, hyperbole. You can say it's, a bit of embellishing, saying we're the best there ever was. And it kind of falls into like the joke on the internet now of like a Meridote with Master Ken. And I can't remember. A few people, when I've tried to explain our style to them and our system, they're like, so you're like an Meridote style? And I had to figure out what that was at first. I was like, well, no, like that's not what we're doing. But I can see how it sounds that way. To cure that to some degree, that's not the way it was really portrayed, if that's the way, at least to me. Tom was like, look, it's more of a humble thing. We realize there's a lot of information out there and a lot of talented practitioners, and we want to get what we can get out of them. It's not that we think we're above it. We also, I was talking about cognitive bias in the last one. Most styles, if they learn something they think is really neat, they want it to be the answer for everything, the one thing. And what the family really found and taught Tom, what he said was really influential, especially with his own life experiences, there's no one thing. The one thing is everything. You've got to know things. You can't fix things you're not exposed to. And so through the family system, what Wu Ji Quan Fa, we were looking to have a core approach that can solve many things and make small adaptations to go into different types of fighting. You might have a really talented, like hand-to-hand fighter, and they specialize in that, and they go into rings, and they do that, and they've got, legitimate, a lot of experience there, and that works. Suddenly bring a knife, if you felt threatened by someone who's that much bigger and more superior to you, and you were to pull a weapon like a stick or a knife, if they have never fought against those weapons or used those weapons, they really don't understand, and you're skilled with it, it could be a complete game changer. We as a species, we don't win on the planet because we are physically able to beat them hand to hand. We win because of weapons and tools. And so the family system was very much built around that battlefield reality of weapons and changing the game. You kind of need to be a jack of all trades, because the reality is we're not really interested in contests to prove that we're the best specialist in an area. If I realize my opponent is a specialist somewhere, combat allows strategy. I'm not going to fight where you specialize. And so I need to have more breadth of knowledge and take the fight somewhere that they can't go and know what limits are. That was more the thinking. Right, wrong. And then over time, if you study it long enough, once you get to be a jack of all trades, you kind of become a king of all trades is the idea. Get good at all of them, and then you kind of start to see how each thing integrates. That's how our system is learned. You know, you go over, and you deep, you go over, you deepen, you go over, you deepen. Except when I was learning, I'm trying to get the depth kind of done as we do the breadth when I teach, and that's what Tom had kind of gravitated to. His later seminars, a lot of advanced stuff, and he said, you know, my goal is I'm going to teach it early, teach it the way it really is, and like over multiple exposures they get it. The family's old approach to teaching, and now I'm on a tangent of how the family taught, but the family's old approach to teaching was like, don't introduce things you're not going to be able to get people to understand. There's kind of a bias of like, it's a fail if you introduce something that goes over a student's head. And that is kind of, I've seen at least in my small sampling of Chinese culture, kind of a part of it. They would rather teach like a smaller lesson that later we will change as you prove you're more advanced to the real lesson than to just teach the real lesson repetitively. And in the West, we more use the real lesson repetitively, and we teach that from the beginning, generally speaking, you know. I mean, that's a huge generalization to say East and West, you know how many people that is, but you can see that pretty often. You'll notice that if you study both of these. And are there going to be contradictions? Sure, there's individual groups that do things their own way. But with Wu Ji Quan Fa, so kind of talking about that, let's talk about the Ge Huang family system. So, some of the other notes I have here, kind of going back to the lore of how it was. The Ge Huang family system. 550 to 500 BC is what Tom had me write down. In the pre-Warring States period, the Ge family was the imperial family of the Northern Empire, which was north of the, he wrote Jiang River, which is the Jiang River. The Chang River shouldn't have been two words. It's like the Long River, right? They've got the Huang, if I remember, and the Chang. So one is Long River, the other's that. So up in the north, basically. The Ge emperor was known for being a man of the people. He only collected enough taxes to preserve borders, protect their way of life. He's beloved by the people. He thought of himself as like a father to the people. His job was to protect, preserve the people, preserve their freedom, to maintain the peace. The emperor had observed that their less prosperous neighbors would often rather attack, steal, and plunder rather than spending their time building their own countries. The philosophy of his rule was one of benevolent, strong freedom. The Ge family had their own fighting styles. So did the Huang family. The Huang family was like a cousin family to the Ge family. There were other powerful families in the imperial court who had subgroups of warmongers in their families rather than warriors. And that's where the distinction would always be made when Tom was teaching. They interpreted the benevolence of the Ge family emperor as weakness, and thus these factions made attempts to overthrow through political intrigue, sometimes through overt military tactics. 500 BC, because of the aggression of these factions and other neighboring aggressive factions, which actually fits quite a bit. I studied a bunch of Chinese history when I was learning the language, and it was a very small area around the Chang River, the Changjiang River, whatever. There's a lot of, you can look it up, and then the Huang River, right there. That was like the empire, and it was, long rivers, and that's where everyone was. And there's actually quite a few factions, and then it gets into like the lore of all Chinese history. So it's kind of interesting. The lore here is very similar to all, but I know that a lot of families seem to have like an origin story that dates back, depending on how they work. So it makes sense the family would explain it that way. And because of the aggression of these factions and other neighboring aggressive nations, the Huang family was commissioned to protect the Ge family. From there, the Huang family needed to learn the martial material of the other 6 loyal families. The Ge emperor ordered the other families to share their martial systems. Thus began the tradition. That's like sharing military technology back then. And so it was kind of an unprecedented thing from what Doc had said to Tom. Once the royal styles were analyzed and integrated, they continued searching out and integrating all martial styles, military schools, etc. Huang family developed the style and taught it to the Ge family. They always focused on teaching warriorhood and values of peace. They taught benevolence to go along with the power and the skills they developed. They tried to emphasize that. Just like the brochure said, they noticed that if you don't do that, you get a lot of problems. Eventually, another family usurped the imperial role, and the Ge family became a family of the royal court, but was no longer in charge. And that would make sense with kind of the breakdown of the Warring States period that started, and they had to survive as a family through that Warring States period. Which is kind of the birth and the growth place after having Jian Pai was given that to be able to study. The other ones, they had a very superior style. But the Chinese are very secretive. When they have an advantage, you don't tell people. Just like the Art of War, if you read the Art of War, a ton of the ethics of old world Chinese thinking is embedded in that and in the Tao Te Ching. In a lot of those books, you can see a genius in that old culture that's lost, and it's a different logic nowadays. Like I've had people say, well, if the system had this much to it, wouldn't it win every competition, and like anyone that studied it should just be so much better? And the reality is, no, it doesn't always work that way. And the second assumption there is that you would want the attention that comes from that. I certainly had that starting as a young person. When you're a young person, your bias is, I want lots of attention. You come to realize that's not always a blessing. That can be a curse. And so the family didn't want to be sought out by people. They don't want all the problems with it. They just want to be able to do what they're doing and have an advantage, and not tell you what their advantage is, so that they can continue to have the advantage. That's once the secret's out on what your advantage is, it doesn't last. People figure it out, and now you got to come up with something new. And so part of the thinking that is in the Art of War, you can see, is when it talks about when you are strong, appear as though you're inept to draw an attack. When you are inept, of course, appear like you're strong to make them not want to attack. But that's they didn't want the attention, so they developed a very superior style, and then they survived that period of time. And you can see that same logic. I don't know how I got on that tangent a little bit. I forgot already. But the Ge family, as they were a family of that royal court, they survived that period, and the family style kept growing, and they just kept it as a family tradition. Right? In 1942, a note he makes, the development of the family system continued from there, but after World War II, the Ge family was with kind of the losing faction, so to speak. They would have been affiliated with Chiang Kai-shek and had to leave China and flee. Interesting story, about Doc that he would always tell to Tom is that, that's how part of how Doc ended up dying in 92 or 94 is when they had to flee. They said basically when Mao took over, and you probably can hear my daughter in the background. She's having a good time downstairs with her mom. But when they had to flee China, first there's like 4 or 5 years of what was called the Time of Great Suggestions, is the way they told it. And Mao had like all the former royal families and wealthy families. Sorry, I shouldn't say royal, because they were already in a republic by then, but like some of the former in the Qing dynasty and the Ming dynasty that had, the more influential families, they would be brought to these conferences for 3 or 4 years to have suggestions. And what should we do to rebuild the country now that we're going to make the communist kind of goal, right, a reality? And then the 4th or 5th year, I can't remember what it was, people went to the same conferences, and they were wined and dined all the other years and treated like, yeah, this is great. But on about the 5th year, you didn't get to leave. And the word got out that, people that are going to these conferences are getting killed and are not leaving. And they had decided they needed to purge everyone that disagreed with them. The word got out. Doc was in his teens, was able to escape when they're trying to get off the mainland, which would be pretty crazy. He was hiding underneath these places that had pigeon houses, where I had all these carrier pigeons, and he just slept in bird crap for days, and no one would look to see him there. And he caught a really bad bird flu that almost killed him. He got back to, and they had some good Chinese medicine doctors in their family. When he got back to them on Taiwan, they were able to treat him, and they got it to go into remission. But it never really went away. Later, when he went in for kind of a routine medical procedure, this is a lot later in his life, before it killed him, he, from what Tom said, just like going under, they had to use anesthesia to, I think it was to remove what they thought might be a cancerous lump or something, and then it triggered that bird flu, and when he woke up, it was like that flu kind of started again and could not get it under control, and it got to the point where he just couldn't breathe without a machine, and decided he wasn't going to keep breathing, and called everyone around him. He was either going to breathe on his own or he wasn't going to keep going. And he said, "This isn't living. This is just existing. You guys know how I feel about that." And he checked out that way. So that was where it changed. They left, and so the Ge family no longer used the system, but the Huang family kept trying to develop it. And that's when Mao took over. 1998, said the analysis and integration process concluded in 98 approximately. Since then, we're bridging the system, but there are conflicts on how and who should bridge the system. We are out on our own. We're like a orphaned child that is not acknowledged, to joke from the family. And not to get too personal. In my family, there's the kids that are officially from one side, they're official, and there's one that was kind of out of wedlock, and that we've since we know him, and I've talked to him in good standing, but for a long time he didn't know who his family was, and it was from an infidelity, right? So my point there is just that, like, that's kind of what we are with the family. They're not going to acknowledge us or work with us. Tongwei is Tom's group. Doc and our QE allowed him to learn. Most of the people in the family didn't agree with that decision, and so we land like we are. How did that happen? That becomes another big question people have, and that comes through really getting more into Tom Garriga history. I tried to lay out like Ge family, Huang family history. Maybe that makes sense. That's the legend, at least, that they explained to Tom. At the end of the day, Tom never met the people from 2,000 years ago, and it's a story, and that's the one he was told, and that's the one he passed on. I don't know how you'd verify or unverify, or to confirm or deny that story. But that is at least the legend of how the Ge Jian Pai, which is our primary influence into Wu Ji Quan Fa, came to be. And Ge Jian Pai went on to incorporate the other, at least, like when we say 1,400 styles too, and 85 military schools of thought, that number sounds astronomical. And I think over 2,000 years, you would do that. That's like less than, one style in a year on average, right? You're not. Another thing to realize, though, is that, Chinese martial arts through the history, they have a huge issue with fragmenting. And like when you look at 1,400, it's not necessarily most of the influence. If you look at the big 18, which will be listed, like I'll have that on the page. I'll try to get, and you can probably find that if you're on the website. Go to like FAQ, and it'll say the styles that influence us. But there's probably like 100 styles of Bagua on its own. Literally, I mean, like if they fragment, and this is one of the challenges that we're going to face too, as a system. And I might have to do the Tom Garriga one next. We're getting close to 20 minutes. And this kind of finishes out the family system, or the Ge history a little bit. But they don't like to define what they're doing into a system way that you can branch off of and still do it. And so when someone else changes it, it kind of changes the whole style. And so you have like a bunch of different styles of Bagua. You got closest one I've seen on the web, like I said, is Jiangrong Bagua, but our interpretations of the techniques are very different. Tom said that, depending on the lineage, they don't realize all the grappling that's involved in it, and the neck cranks and the neck breaks. And even sometimes the internal energy part of it is taught very differently. And so each person kind of ends up with their own style. And I want to still keep teaching a system where, honestly, people can learn things and get past me in those and do what their natural talents get them to be able to do. And I can keep dipping into it and learning, and we can have a strong community that way. But instead of it fragmenting to be like this guy's version of that and this guy's version, Shaolin is like a kind of a branches off, and you get other branch off styles like Choi Lei Foot, which is a branch off from a couple monks to the left and only got some pieces, and then built on those pieces they had, and in some ways made a cooler side style. At least that's the legend I was told about it, and that the family had. So the family kind of chronicles all this through the history, and so some of the histories that I have learned, and then I'll hear other people, are different, and some are the same. With all that said, this is kind of a trip down. Those of you that like this kind of martial arts nerddom a little bit, Gong Fu nerddom. But we all enjoy talking about it, and hopefully when we get together we can chat more. I'm happy to answer questions. Hopefully this is a good start. That's the notes that Tom kind of had about it that he shared with me, and some of the conversation I can remember about it. There's a lot more. Tom, had promoted it in 1998. He had a record of 137 students to first step. 7 had made it to fourth step. He had just 1 at that time, Aaron Hunt, to fifth step. 2012's when Bruce Young, Adam Adair, and me got fifth step. And so that's kind of the history, and then it starts going into Tom Garriga from there. So we'll pick that up next time, talk more about Tom and his experience learning, and keep going.